Good morning, everybody. In the second half of the Gospel of St. Mark, on three different occasions, Jesus, in speaking to the 12, to his disciples, he reminds them that he's going to suffer greatly, that he's going to be put to death, and that ultimately he would rise again. So they heard that message, but somehow it didn't sink in. And consequently, you find that as Jesus was dying on the cross, all of his disciples, almost all of them, had disappeared. And you wonder why. Well, obviously, they saw what was happening to Jesus. And so they were afraid that what was happening to him would be happening to them also. And so they disappeared. So the next time, of course, we encounter Jesus is after the resurrection, where he did in fact rise. And that in and of itself was amazing, because it was the first time it happened, and I suppose nobody believed that it could happen. But certainly in and through Jesus, it did happen. So you have Jesus immediately after the resurrection, and he's on his way back to the Father. And one would say, if I were he, I would have gone straight away, okay? And furthermore, like soon after that, he encountered the disciples, or he called them together. And if I were he on that occasion, I would certainly have some words to say to them, like, where was I when I needed you the most? How come you disappeared when I was really suffering? And how come you weren't at the crucifixion? Very, 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 very telling and very, very real questions. But somehow he didn't ask them those questions. All he did tell them was who he was, because they had a difficult time recognizing him. Because resurrection doesn't mean that you're going to come back exactly the same as you left the earth. Resurrection implies some kind of transformation. And so Jesus was the same, but he was different. And I think he tried very hard to convey that message to them. And they in turn asked him, which is amazing at that point in time, they said to him, Lord, at this stage, are you going to return Israel to its former glory? You know, that was always a question in Israel. They'd been dominated for a couple of hundred years by the Romans. They hated Romans. And so one could see that it was always an issue. But they'd been around Jesus long enough, I think, to know that that wasn't his issue, that he wasn't there as a sort of a powerful leader, rather he was there as a spiritual leader. Nevertheless, they asked him that question, are you going to restore Israel at this point in time? And of course, he didn't say he was. He said it's not for you to worry about a situation like that. And then of the 12, he has sort of selected Peter, whom at a much earlier time he had chosen Peter as the leader. But Peter, as you know, had fallen into hard times. He had denied Jesus. And so at this point in time, he questioned Peter. He had three questions for Peter, one in a row. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And the answer, of course, by Peter. And then when Peter said yes, Jesus' response is, feed my lambs, ultimately feed my sheep. In other words, you are to be the leader of the yan. You're the one who is to really feed the flock. And that takes us right up to the very end, when Jesus was about to ascend into heaven. And he said to them, he says, you are to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, and to the ends of the earth. So they were to carry on his message. And he says, but you are to do this. But he says, you have to wait, he says. You have to wait first for the promise of the Father. And the promise of the Father is the event which takes place next weekend, which is the giving of the Spirit. And the giving of the Spirit changed everything as far as the disciples were concerned. Up to that time, they doubted everything. They were afraid. They felt powerless. And you can see why they sort of disappeared. But it's amazing once they got enough confidence to wait for the Spirit, that the Spirit was the transforming event in their lives. And hear about that next Sunday because of Pentecost Sunday. But it's amazing for individuals, a whole bunch of individuals who were ordinary people, but who felt very powerless by the time Jesus died, how when the Spirit came upon them they were so completely different. They went out and they took on all kinds of people in terms of message, okay? And they were, at least initially, they were very successful. They were very successful in the process. So today, next Sunday, we think about that event, the giving of the Spirit, and realize that the effect the Spirit had on them. And as we think about that, that was the church back then. That was the beginning of the church. So today, we are the church of today, okay? Whether we like it or not, we are the church of today. And like the church back then, we are called to make a difference in our world. And the two words that was mentioned time and again for the disciples were the word proclamation and the word witness. And those two words are very different for each, and the disciples did both of them. The witness obviously is obvious, that to be a witness, you're a witness of him, meaning the kind of life that he led, you attempt to live that life in your life. In other words, he is your model as far as witnesses are concerned. And I think that applies to each and every one of us. And then the other issue, of course, is proclamation is your willingness to either knock on doors or just touch other people and say, how are you doing? Would you like to come to church, or would you like to, whatever the case may be. The other day, I had an email from a guy whom I haven't seen in a year and a half. And I haven't seen him at Mass in a year and a half. So I just responded to his note to me. It says, I haven't been seeing you at church lately, okay? And, I was waiting for a nice positive response. But his response was, no, I'm tired of church. I've given up on church. I'm not happy with happening throughout the country, not just with the Catholic Church, with all churches. So I've given up all religion. So it wasn't the response I'd hoped for, but at least it was a response. So you might want to challenge yourself and say, to what extent are you prepared to sort of reach beyond yourself? And if this is important to you, which I know it is, then I think you have that responsibility to share it, okay? It's good news. It's not just good news, it's very good news if it's lived well. And we're all called not just to live it to the best of our ability, but to share that faith, that good news with everybody we encounter in our own lives. Amen.